Hello, and welcome to another video lecture for Mr. Mosier's 8th grade American History class. This is our second part of a three-part series looking at kind of the lead up to the American Revolution. In part 1, we discussed the French and Indian War and the Proclamation of 1763 and the Stamp Act. For today, we will be looking in the textbook on the same chapter and section out of our United States History textbook, Chapter 3, Section 5, Conflict in the Colonies, pages 98 to 103. The guiding questions for this section of the lecture will be, what was the Quartering Act of 1768 and how did the colonists react? What was the Townshend Acts and how did the colonists react? What happened at the Boston Massacre? What was the Tea Act of 1773 and how did this upset the colonists? Who are the Sons of Liberty? And then what happened at the Boston Tea Party and how did Britain react with the Intolerable Acts? So that will be part of our discussion for today. So let's get started. The Quartering Act of 1765 was passed by British Parliament, and its purpose was to provide for supplies and housings for British troops. This would include that the colonists would have to put together salt and vinegar, which sounds like an odd thing, but that was what was used to preserve food. There's no refrigeration back then, so that was like a food preservative to keep it fresh so it wouldn't spoil, and then provide things like bedding and cooking and utensils. And so this was a really large annoyance because British soldiers would knock on the door and you'd open the door and they might, confiscate your home as part of their bunks for their troops and for their soldiers. This was a huge inconvenience for the Americans. And a lot of the colonists will react by basically not providing for funds to buy salt and vinegar in the colonies, so there just wouldn't be any, so they wouldn't be able to give to the British soldiers. Now this will become such a sticky point of the colonists that when we write our new government under the Constitution and set up our Bill of Rights, one of the very top amendments to the Constitution, one of our Bill of Rights, is going to deal with this particular issue. It was such a thorny issue for the colonists. They just despised the idea that they were going to be inconvenienced and forced to house these British soldiers. Now, England was doing this because they said, well, here's America. There's this tensions between the Native Americans. The French are still around. Even though they lost the French and Indian War, we need to have a garrison or house troops there in the colonies to protect them and provide safety for them. And the colonies have to do their part to chip in. But that's not how the colonists felt. They felt kind of inconvenienced by this. The Townshend Acts are a series of laws passed by British Parliament. They're called the Townshend Acts, named after Charles Townshend, who was a member of the British Parliament. And they're basically a series of laws passed in 1767 by Parliament that, again, tax certain items. Remember, Britain is still in debt from the French and Indian War. They still have to pay those debts. And they figure, well, the war was fought in the colonies, they should have to chip in. So the last time they did a tax was on paper, the Stamp Act, and that ended up having to be repealed because of all the protests, boycotts that were taking place in the colonies. So in 67, they decided to pass more taxes, this time not just on paper, but also on glass, paint, paper, tea. So it was multiple different types of items that the colonists had to pay a tax on. Again, the reaction from the colonists was very upsetting for them. Why should we have to pay a tax on something we had no say in? This was passed over in London, thousands of miles away. That's not fair. That's no taxation without representation. So the colonists, again, they protested and they organized. They boycotted British goods. They said, we're going to stop buying from England, which hurt British businesses. And in 1770, the taxes under the Townshend Acts will again be repealed. They'll be canceled, except for the tax on tea. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Vocabulary term here, massacre. A massacre is usually a very negative term. It usually refers to the brutal killing of innocent people. Okay? So it's like a mass murder of somebody. Very, very brutal. And this will bring us to another important incident leading up to the American Revolution, something known as the Boston Massacre. Now, the historical question we have to ask ourselves is, who is to blame for the Boston Massacre? Is it the British or is it the colonists? Who is at fault in this particular incident? Well, if we look at this particular picture here, we can maybe think historically of this as a primary document and say, it looks like you've got some soldiers kind of firing into the crowd, but you also have people in the crowd that seem to be doing some things too, kind of attacking the soldiers. So if I'm looking at this document, I can say, well, the soldiers and the colonists seem to be both kind of the aggressor, right? If I look at this particular picture here, I don't see the colonists being very aggressive. In fact, I see the soldiers all very much organized, firing directly into the crowd, and here's all these innocent people bleeding on the street. A very vicious, horrible scene. So what happened? Who was at fault at this? The Boston Massacre took place on March 5th, 1770, kind of as tensions are beginning to build in the colonies, especially in the New England colonies like Massachusetts. A very noisy mob of colonists confront British troops at kind of one of those tax collection houses. And in the incident, 5 colonists were killed, including an African-American, Crispus Attucks, who you can see here laying here in this particular picture, that was put together by Paul Revere, and 10 other colonists were injured. Now, there will be a trial on these soldiers to see if they were guilty of committing basically murder. And John Adams, who will be a patriot and become a very important figure in American history, actually will be the lawyer who defended these soldiers. Now, in the course of the trial, you had 2 points of view. The Americans' point of view, which you see kind of portrayed in this picture, is that we were peacefully protesting, and then the soldiers just opened fire and just killed us. And our backs were turned, and we were just slaughtered in the streets. And that's kind of what this picture is trying to portray. The British version of events was that we came out to protect this building. The crowd was very angry. They were shouting things like, "You lobster backs," which was kind of a bad name given to the red-coated soldiers. They were throwing snowballs and ice chunks and bottles, and had these billy clubs that they used to kind of down on the wharf at the docks, and they were kind of smashing and beating onto things. Very kind of aggressive, angry crowd. And they kind of got in the faces of the soldiers, and in that scuffle, a shot was fired, and the soldiers kind of panicked and fired, thinking they were being shot at. And before the captain could bring order out of this chaos, unfortunately, 5 American colonists were killed. And in the course of the trial, other eyewitnesses were brought in, and it kind of came out that the colonists weren't completely innocent. But regardless of what happened, it's still going to create this kind of this animosity, this hatred between the Americans and now these British soldiers. Because remember, these British soldiers are living in their homes, right? The Quartering Act. They're in the streets. They're marshaling and marching up the streets and living in people's homes. And so tensions in Boston especially are really beginning to kind of increase, okay? And even though the soldiers were found innocent, these types of paintings by like Paul Revere are going to be spread around the colonies that this was a massacre. The British soldiers just slaughtered American colonists. And it's going to create this tension in the era between the American colonists and the British. The Tea Act of 1773 was passed by Lord North, who was the Prime Minister of England at the time. He's kind of a government official right below the King in British Parliament. What it did was it basically lowered the cost of tea, which you might think, hey, that sounds like a good idea, but it gave complete control over the tea industry to the East India Company. If you are a fan of the Pirates of the Caribbean movie franchise, that name might sound a little familiar because that was the bad guys in those movies. Now, the East India Company was a monopoly. That meant that you only could buy tea from this company. That would be as if today we're going to say, hey, we're going to make this a Coke country, right? Only Coke products. Pepsi, if you like Pepsi, sorry, you can't buy Pepsi. You can only buy from Coca-Cola. For the colonists, it was very, very unsettling. They were very, very upset that this monopoly was taking place, that one company was going to control all that industry in that location, and they were worried that if they monopolized tea, might they monopolize sugar, cotton, other types of industries that were essential to the economy of the colonies. This could hurt the colonies' economies. And so as a react of the Tea Act, it's going to lead to another event known as the Boston Tea Party. Now, before we get to the Tea Party, we have to talk about the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty were patriots, mostly based out of New England and Massachusetts. These were a group of colonists who formed kind of a secret society to protest British policies. They do a lot of letter writing and organizing and meeting to say, how can we stop what England is doing to us? How can we prevent these actions from taking place? Well, these Sons of Liberty, after the Tea Act, are going to dress as Mohawk Indians, and on December 16th, 1773, in the middle of winter, there are several ships in Boston Harbor, and they're going to sneak on board, and they're dumping 90,000 pounds of tea into the Boston Harbor. Now, as you can tell, this is a pretty big event. Large crowds of the citizens of Boston show up along the wharf to see these Americans dressed as Mohawk Indians, basically damaging and breaking open these tea chests and then dumping the tea basically into the harbor. The reaction for the colonists is very much, yeah, stick it to England. But the British see this very differently. This is a destruction of property, a lot of property, and this infuriates the government in England, which causes them to pass the Intolerable Acts. John Adams, who will become a patriot and will support the cause for American independence, will say of the Boston Tea Party, this is the most magnificent moment of all. This destruction of tea is so bold, so daring, so firm, it must have important consequences. And that's exactly what's going to happen as a result, because England is going to be furious, and they're going to pass what's called the Intolerable Acts. Now, technically, they're called the Coercive Acts. That's what England calls them. But they are so punishing to the colonies that they become known as the Intolerable Acts. And specifically, it's meant to punish the colony of Massachusetts, which is where Boston is located in. So this is the British Parliament and the King. It's a series of laws that are punitive. They are punishing Boston and Massachusetts. They close the harbor of Boston until the tea is paid for. Massachusetts is put under strict government control. These local town assemblies that were very common in these different communities up and down the colonies, where citizens could come and discuss and express concerns facing their community, were shut down in Massachusetts. They were no longer allowed to assemble. And again, for the colonists, that's kind of taking away their voice. And then British soldiers would be tried not in the colonies anymore, but would be tried over in England, which if you're trying somebody thousands of miles away and you're thinking about eyewitness testimony, you're going to miss out on the testimony of the colonists, right? They're not going to be able to share what they know about an incident involving a British soldier. So is it going to be a fair trial? Probably not. So that's other issue really upsets the colonists. And then England, of course, kind of puts Boston and Massachusetts under martial law. More British soldiers begin to basically come into Massachusetts to kind of restore order. These Intolerable Acts are just going to be angry around the colonies. That further upsets the colonists because they feel that this is really an attack on one of the 13 colonies, but really this could be done to all of the other 12 colonies. So attack on one of our sister colonies is kind of an attack on all of us. So it acts, instead of a dividing faction of the colonies, it actually ends up uniting them. As we can see from this political cartoon, Join or Die, you see the initials of the different 13 colonies: South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and then, of course, New England. It says either we unite as colonies, or we are going to be, abused by the British. So this ends up creating what's called the First Continental Congress. This is going to be a series of 50 leaders from 12 of the 13 original colonies, and they will come and meet together to kind of discuss what should we do. They agree to send a letter to the King and Parliament about their displeasure, not liking these Intolerable Acts, and they decide to boycott British goods, because it worked before with some of these other acts to kind of hurt British businesses and see if that will help take place. So that's the reaction, the First Continental Congress. So as you can see here, things in the colonies are beginning to escalate. Tensions between the British government and different colonial leaders, and especially in Massachusetts and Boston. This is just creating this tension that's rising. You can just feel the energy kind of picking up. Thank you for listening. As always, if you have questions or concerns, please make sure you come talk to your teacher. Thank you.